Okay, so this is basically the second part of what has been already shared with you. The book is Understanding the Process of Economic Change by North Douglas. And we have so far discussed part one of the book, which was, from chapter two to chapter six. And now we are, moving on to section two of this book, which is chapter seven towards chapter 13. So let's start, and this is because at this part, which is part two, the road ahead, this is where actually North Douglas applies everything from part one to the actual historical records, and so he now we are going to start our discussion. To understand, part two, you need to actually watch my previous lecture on part one, and it also builds your base for part two. So this portion basically provides evidence for the theoretical framework, and North is not just telling a story. He is basically showing that how his models of beliefs, institutions, and path dependence has actually explained, the historical outcomes. So they provide, depth to the concepts that were, abstract in part one. So when you read about the path dependence in chapter 5, it is a concept. But when you read about how Spain's, feudal institutional heritage, form the different, form different heritages, then it becomes, more realistic for you to understand. So they actually provide lessons in this part for current development policies, that what has worked in the past, what has failed, under what condition it failed. And these are not just, historical curiosities. These are crucial inputs for, thinking about policy today. So the main historical cases North is trying to cover is that the long evolution of human environment from the hunter gatherers to modern interdependent economies is all about the story. And finally we discussed the question of how poorly performing economies today can improve their performance, and each of these cases is rich and interesting for us to understand. I'll try to give you the essential points for each. Okay, so let's move to the next part, which is part two. We'll start with chapter 7. Chapter 7 gives us, the big historical picture, in which, North is trying to explain you from Neolithic revolutions to today, and he's trying to put the current human conditions to the context. The key conceptual distinction, North draws is between two very different kinds of uncertainty that humans have had to manage throughout the history. So first is this, that the uncertainty which is associated with the physical environment, and especially, that will the harvest fail? Will there be drought or flood? Will a predator or enemy attack? So this is what, is the uncertainty that has dominated human life for most of the history. And the institutions that evolved over thousands of years, such as communal land ownership or sharing norms or kinship network, religious rituals, were all adapted to handle this kind of uncertainty. And they were remarkably well suited for it. Second, most importantly, the uncertainty which is associated with the human environment. So the first thing is the uncertainty which is associated with physical environment, and the second thing is the uncertainty which is associated with human environment. So for the second part, which is the uncertainty associated with human environment, you might ask questions like, will my trading partner honor the contract? Will the government respect my property rights, or will the financial system be stable? And will new technology make my skills obsolete? So this is the certainty that dominates modern economic life as well, and it requires completely different institutional structures than the ones evolved for the physical environment. Now the great challenge of development is the transition between these two types: uncertainty with the physical environment and uncertainty with the human environment. So The institutions which are suited to manage the physical uncertainties, which are typically based on personal relationships, which is more suited towards physical uncertainty, such as personal relationships, as I said, communal sharing or traditional hierarchy, are often actively harmful for managing human environment uncertainty. So they create barriers to impersonal exchange, to individual initiative, and to formal contract enforcement. So they are basically two great economic revolutions that has happened in the human history. The first economic revolution basically was the development of agriculture. The Neolithic transition between, not between, but it was actually, it began around 18,000 BCE. Before this, all humans were hunters. They were the hunter gatherers, and after that they settled agriculture, enabled much larger populations. There was specialization of labor, and there were complex social hierarchy. It also basically required fundamentally new institutions, which means having property rights in land, having management of surplus, and having governance of settled communities. But this revolution has also created new problems because with settled agriculture, it is more vulnerable to weather, it is more vulnerable to pests and diseases in ways that hunter-gatherer life is not. So it enables wealth accumulation and therefore the possibility of theft and conquest. It also creates the need for states and therefore the possibility of exploitation. So every benefit of Neolithic revolution came with the institutional problems that are attached to it. Now, the second economic revolution was the systematic application of scientific knowledge to economic production. And this was, beginning with the scientific revolution of 16th and 7th century, 16th and 17th century. And it, went to 18th or 19th century, roughly speaking. And this is, what produces the industrial revolution and the extraordinary improvement in human living standards of the past 2 centuries. But again, this revolution created new institutional challenges like, how do you protect intellectual property rights, the product of scientists and inventors, in a way that basically has incentivizes further innovations without creating monopoly rents. So, how do you manage the social disruption of rapid technological change, such as the displacement of workers, the destruction of traditional industries, and how do you govern financial systems that can channel capital to productive uses but also produce catastrophic crises? So we are still working on the institutional answers to question that has been raised by the second economic revolution. And what we already have in our mind is what may be the third, which you might call as the digital revolution. So the third, which is the digital revolution, whose institutional challenges are even much novel. And it's not no more. It's digital. It's more like AI revolution. Life expectancy in UK, 24 years in the early was around 24 years in the early 14th century, and today it's 77 years. So this is more than a tripling of life expectancy, and the causes of this increased life expectancy is basically the conquest of infectious diseases, better nutrition, clear water, good sanitation facilities. But all of this has required institutional innovations, public health systems, clean water infrastructure, and food regulations. So infant mortality in the UK was 218 deaths per thousand in the earlier 17th centuries, which has now reduced to only 6 per thousand today. So 97% of reduction in the infant mortality rate in the UK. So Robert Fogel's research shows that improved nutrition alone explains a significant portion or a significant part of that. So children who are well nourished in their early lives have better immune functions, they have better cognitive development and longer lives. And GDP per capita in if you talk about in year 1000 AD, the average income of the the average income of the world's currently rich countries was lower than that of the currently poor countries. So by 1998, the ratio was nearly 7 to 1. So the great divergence, why rich countries, pulled ahead so dramatically, is one of the central questions of economic history. And North answer is institutions. If you talk about the transaction cost in US economy, such as that given by Wallace and North, which estimated that the transaction sector, which is could be banking, insurance, finance, legal services, then obviously the portion of government which is engaged in enforcement and regulation amounted to roughly around 50% of US GNP by the late 20th century. But it got up from about 25% in 1870. So this growth reflects the increasing complexity of impersonal exchange, and it costs more to facilitate exchange as market becomes more complex. So these numbers tell us a story that the transformation of human conditions in the past 2 centuries have been extraordinary, but it has been concentrated in some countries and not other. And understanding why is this the mission of this book. So institutions suited to physical environment, and this was the dominant environment for all of the human history until about 200 years ago. So small group corporation based upon the kinship and personal relationships, which had redistributive norms, sharing within the community to manage risk, or having collectivist 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 culture is about that the individual is subordinate to a group, which enables personal exchange. So you deal with people personally, status based hierarchy, so your position is defined by your birth, age, gender, lineage, and the this is basically the coercive social control, and it involves the conformity, which is enforced by the social pressures and community sanctions, such as it could be religion and magic, which explains what science cannot. So institutions are suited to human environment, which is the dominant environment in modern you can say developed economies. So in-person exchange, you deal with the strangers based upon some formal rules, productive norms. The individuals who create value is basically the ones who are rewarded. An individualistic culture or individual rights and initiatives are really valued over there, which are open to society. There is free entry and exit in markets, and political competition exists. So competence criteria is basically your position, which is defined by what you can do and not who you are. So you talk about rule of law, which means formal enforcement rather than community coercion. Science and rationality as the primary framework for understanding. In Pakistan, we have a society in transition between these two environments, traditional and modern institutions, which coexist and sometimes clash. Now, chapter 8 is basically about the sources of order and disorders. And North makes a very surprising and compelling argument here that economists really put order at the center of their analysis, and that they should do so. So most economic analysis, takes order for granted. Markets work, contracts are enforced, property is secure. You can go about your business without constant fear of violence or exploitation. But for most of people in Western Europe or North America, this is the background assumption of daily life. If you see throughout the human history, and still in large parts of the world today, order is not the background. Disorder, revolution, civil war, some predatory governance, personal insecurity is basically the normal condition. And this order massively increases uncertainty. It destroys the incentives to invest and produce, and it reverses the development. So, the North's definition is that the order is a reduction of the uncertainty that characterizes human interaction through institutions that provide greater predictability. So, disorder is a condition in which rights and privileges are up for grabs. So, where the rules of the games are unstable and everybody's trying to grab what they can before the rules change again. His key insight is basically that order is necessary but not sufficient condition for long run economic growth. So you cannot have a sustained economic development without political order. But political order alone, even authoritarian order, is not enough. So you also need the right institutional structure within that order. And this leads to the debate of order and disorder and why they matter for economics. Now, let's talk about authoritarian order first, because authoritarian order exists when participants find it in their interest, given their expectations about the behavior of others, to obey the rules set by the ruler. Conformity comes, from a mix of coercive force and the social norms. And it can be stable when the ruler has sufficient coercive capacity and when citizens have internalized the legitimacy of the regime. So Singapore, under Lee Kuan Yew is the model North mentions. Then comes, consensual order, which exists, when participants find it in their interest, given their expectations about their behaviors of others, to follow rules they feel are legitimate. So conformity comes, from internalizing of norms rather than, primarily from the coercion. And this is the ideal democracy as well, because it is more self-sustaining, and it is more self-sustaining because it does not depend on a single ruler's capacity or North is very careful not to romanticize the consensual order. In practice, he's trying to say that both types involves a mix of coercion and legitimacy, and no pure authoritarian order would survive without some degree of consent. So there's going to be no consensual order survives without any coercion. So the key insight is basically the shared belief systems which reduce the need for coercion and makes governance more cheaper. So when citizens believe the rules are legitimate, even if they disagree with the specific outcome, they comply without, requiring constant enforcement. And when they do not believe the rules are legitimate, compliance requires even more expensive coercion, which eventually becomes, unsustainable. So order and development. North basically uses the contrast between the United States and Latin America as the central empirical example for his theory of order and disorder. So in United States, the colonial heritage was one of self-government. The British colonies in North America developed their own assemblies, their own property laws, their own commercial practices, and over 150 years before independence. So when independence came in 1776, there was already a functioning institutional structure and not a perfect one. Slavery was a fundamental contradiction, but a functioning one as well. The Constitution of 1787 was not built from scratch. Rather, it was codified and extended existing practices. The informal institution of self government has been developing for generations. You talk about Latin America. The colonial heritage was one of extraction. The entire purpose of Spanish colonialism was to extract precious metals and agriculture commodities for the benefit of the crown. So, we were discussing about the order and development. I'm trying to continue after a small pause. So basically, this from here, not basically use these two examples of United States and Latin America as the central empirical example of his theory of order and disorder. So for United States, he says that the colonial heritage was one of self-government. The British colonies in North America developed their own assemblies, their own property laws, their own commercial practices, and this was, over 150 years before independence. And on the other hand, the Latin America basically was the colonial heritage, which was one of, the kind of extraction. So the entire purpose of Spanish colonialism was to extract the precious metal and the agriculture commodities, particularly to benefit, the crown and the colonial elite. So, in very, simple words, there was no self-government. Everything was governed from Madrid, and there were no uh, competitive markets, we can say. So, trade was also monopolized and controlled. Property rights existed only for those who, with, some connections to the crown. When Latin America independence, came in the earlier 19th centuries, many countries adopted constitutions which are modeled on the US with the same formal structure. But the informal institutions, the shared mental models of citizenship, properties, and governance were completely different. So there was no heritage of self government, and there was no established propertied middle class. And there were deep conflicts between those who inherited basically the colonial privileges and the populations who had been exploited. So the result was basically 2 centuries of stop and go development, which has, episodes of military dictatorship, wealth concentration, weak institutions, and you can say persistent inequalities. So basically, North says that there are four conditions that are necessary for maintaining, political order through the economic change. The condition one is basically having a shared belief system about the legitimate ends of government and these rights of citizens. So when there is, consensus about the basic rules of the political games, what government can and cannot do, what rights citizens have, their system is basically self-enforcing. So politicians basically who violate these beliefs face a pushback not just from the opponents, but from, within their own coalitions as well. The, con- the condition two is basically that there are some constitutional limits as well that lower basically the stakes of political competition. So if winning an election means, total control, the ability to imprison basically the opponents, to seize their assets, and to rewrite all the rules, then political competition becomes, essential and eventually violent. So constitutions that distribute power and limit what winners can do make basically uh, powerful lessons for us. Condition three is about the well-defined property and personal rights. So citizens must be able to recognize when when their rights are basically violated. Where rights are basically easy to violate without much consequences. The more precisely defined the rights are, and the more widely understood those rights are, the harder it is for government to violate them quietly. The condition four is basically about the credible commitment by the state to respect these rights. So formal commitments means nothing if there is no mechanism to enforce them. Separation of power, independent judiciary, free press, you take as civil society, all of these are enforcement mechanisms for the state's commitment to respect rights. Um, so let's move forward and let's question that how disorder spreads, and there are three stages to it as well. In stage one, basically a set of political entrepreneurs articulates new beliefs fundamentally at odds with the existing order. So these beliefs are basically, or you can say that these beliefs are initially held only by some small group of minorities, and you call them radicals. So most of people at this stage think that these radicals are some kind of extreme or irresponsible, but they're moderates who controls the political center, and they are skeptical in stage two, basically, which is in which the opponents of the radicals take action, particularly out of self defense or miscalculations or ideological conviction, that makes basically the radical beliefs appear more confirmed. So the radicals predicted that the existing order was basically threatening in nature for certain groups or values. So when the existing order takes action, that seems to prove this prediction very correct. The radicals gain credibility that did not previously have. So the pivotal moderate players who were skeptical now find evidences that the radicals were right about. In the stage three, which is the pivotal, which moderates, which decides, they provide sufficient political supports for radical action, and this includes revolutions, coups, major institutional changes. So the mechanism works the same way, regardless of whether the resulting change is good or bad. Chapter 9 is titled as Getting It Right and Getting It Wrong. And the North's opening observation is very sobering in nature, because he is trying to say that throughout the human history, getting it wrong has been far more common than getting it right. What does getting it right mean? North specifies that it means correctly understanding how human environment is changing and incorporating the understanding into belief systems of decision makers, and then adjusting institutions accordingly to produce the desired outcomes. But all three steps must happen, and all three frequently go wrong. Step one fails when decision makers have incorrect mental models of what has actually happened. So they misdiagnose the problem. They see inflation as a supply shock when it is a monetary phenomenon. They see unemployment as lack of demand when it is, basically skills mismatch. So they say, or they, perceive that political instability as a foreign inference when it is, domestic institutional failure. Step two fails when even, the correct understanding fails to penetrate the belief system of those in power. So there are many mechanisms, which includes ideological commitment, self-interest, and information filters in hierarchical organizations. And simply, some kind of cognitive resistance to updating the beliefs when new evidence conflict with existing mental model. Step three basically fails when institution changes, even when even when they are very well designed ones. So which actually fail to produce the desired behavioral changes. This happens, where informal constraints and enforcement characteristics do not change along with the formal rules. So when the underlying incentive remains the same, despite new formal institutions. Pakistan's entire post-independent development history is a study in these failures, if you see. So we have had, correct diagnosis at various points. We have had, smart people in the position of power who understood what was needed, and yet we have repeatedly failed at implementations, particularly because the informal institutions, the vested interest, and the enforcement capacity is basically not aligned with the formal reforms. Now let's talk about getting it right, which is the stringent condition. So basically, the shift from personal to impersonal exchange is, in North's analysis, the central challenge of economic development. Now let me explain to you that what he means and why it is so hard. Because personal exchange is the dominant mode of economic life in basically in traditional society. So you buy from people you borrow from relatives, or you do businesses with members of your own community, your own clan or your own ethnic group. So despite of knowing that you may benefit by doing all of this with people you don't know, you choose to have in your own area or with your own people, because you believe that disputes are resolved by community elders and who know all the parties. So enforcement comes from repetition. If you cheat, everyone will know and you will be excluded from the future exchange. So this system works very well for small scale, local, or repeated interactions. Transaction costs are low because trust is high. So built for personal relationships and you can say repetitions. But personal exchange is you can say it's limited because you can only trade with people you know, or who are vouched for you by people you know. So this restricts the size of the market and hence the gains from specialization as well. Now when you move to impersonal exchange, which means trading with strangers, which are based upon some formal contracts, uniform standards and third party enforcement, it allows much larger markets and hence much greater specialization and economic efficiency. This is what modern market economies are built on. But making the transactions, basically making these, uh, basically, what I want to tell you is that, um, basically, the transition basically, from personal to impersonal exchange is not so easy. Rather, it is genuinely difficult. Why is it difficult? Because it requires economic institutions that reward cooperation behaviors with the strangers. That there will be bills of exchange. There will be some negotiations going on. And there is the need of banking, insurance instruments. Political institutions are also needed because that they will enforce that these economic institutions have low costs, and contracts are kept. Courts are also needed. Contract laws are needed. Property registrations are needed. You also need some kind of cultural evolutions, and people must learn to trust strangers based on some institutional guarantees, which is overcoming the genetic predisposition for small group interaction. So the fundamental transition is from personal to impersonal exchange. Now, importantly, let me walk you through North's account of how economies handle this problem of dispersed knowledge, because this is directly relevant to your development strategies. So in basically autarky, a self-sustained community, a self-sufficient community, each person must know everything needed for survival. So you grow your own food, make your own tools, build your own shelter, and you have limited specialization because you cannot trade. As markets grow, specializations become possible and productive. But specialization means you know a lot about your specialty and less about something else. Uh, Rather, you can say less about everything else. So you become, dependent upon others for things you no longer produce for yourself. Trade makes you a better off only if the uncertainty from specialization is more than the compensated by the gains from access to others' product. So this requires low transaction costs. You need to be able to acquire products from others at some reasonable cost without spending enormous resources, in verifying quality. or in negotiating terms. So basically, as markets grow, specialization becomes possible and more productive. But specialization means you know a lot about your specialty and less about everything else. So you become dependent on others for things you know no longer produce for yourself. Trade makes you better off, as I discussed, but it only makes you better off if the uncertainty from specialization is more than compensated by the gains from the access to others' product. So institutions exist precisely to reduce these transactions costs. Guarantees, they produce quality. Trademarks basically signal the reputation. And auditing standards enable trust in financial statements. So professional, you can say professional licensing provides assurance about the service quality. And all of these are institutional solutions to the knowledge integrated problem. For developing countries, the ones like us, this creates a specific challenge because they need to build the institutional infrastructure that enables low-cost knowledge integration. But they are competing with developed countries that have had centuries to build these infrastructure. For example, a chemical engineer in Pakistan cannot achieve you can say um uh, okay, let me put it that way, that um, let me put it in this way that a chemical engineer in Pakistan cannot achieve her full productivity potential if she cannot actually access, the complementary knowledge, the research networks, or the quality inputs, or the financial capital at a very reasonable cost. And the institutional infrastructure that this makes all of this accessible in Germany or South Korea does not yet exist in Pakistan. So the implication is that development requires building institutional infrastructure and not just acquiring human capital. So having educated people is very necessary but insufficient. This section of basically chapter 9 challenges a very common belief about economists of a libertarian perspective. The belief that it's basically the belief that once you have the property rights and the rule of law, markets will perform very good automatically. So North basically says that this is a very dangerous fantasy. The Enron scandal in the US is his example because here was a company operating in a country with strong property rights, having strong rule of law, having sophisticated financial markets, and yet the institutional framework had evolved in ways that provided incentives for massive fraud. So the corporate governance rules, the auditing standards, the regulatory oversight, all had developed, the gaps that Iran management exploited. The point is not that the markets are bad. The point is that the well-functioning markets must be actively maintained. The specific institutions required to make a market work, the rules of competition, the disclosure requirements, the enforcement mechanism will vary across different, you can say, different kinds of market. And as technology, human capital, and the structure of the economy change, the institutional requirements for efficient markets change too. So capital markets are essentially sensitive to this. Japan's capital markets in the 1950s and 1960s were brilliantly suited to channeling the savings into industrial investment for catch-up growth. By the 1990s, the same institutional structure has become a trap, which, protecting insolvent banks, misallocating capital, and preventing the restructuring that the economy has needed. chapter 10, which is about the rise of the Western world. So, chapter 10 is basically the big historical chapter where North asks that why did Western Europe, which was a relatively backward part of the world in the 10th century, achieved world hegemony by the 18th century? And what challenged? And why there was a challenge? And this is a great puzzle of modern economic history as well. Because in the year 1000 AD, China was ahead of Europe in technology, in terms of gunpowder, in terms of printing, the compass, the paper money. So the Islamic world has preserved and extended Greek science and was more advanced than Europe in mathematics and medicines. And India was a major trading civilization. By 1800s, Western Europe dominated the world economically. Not just economically, but militarily as well and technologically as well. So the great divergence is basically the central question. And North's answer is institutional. It is not geography alone, though that mattered, but it is not, the culture alone, though that mattered too, but it is the specific combination of institutional arrangements that has emerged in parts of the Western Europe, particularly the Netherlands and the Englands, that made possible that made the possible sustained accumulation of knowledge and productive application of that knowledge to economic problems. So the key to basically these institutional arrangements is basically the political fragmentations combined with cultural unity. Western Europe was politically fragmented, and dozens of competing city-states, principalities, kingdoms, basically, was included. So why Western Europe? The initial conditions in the basically 10th century, Western Europe was recovering from centuries of disorder. So the Roman Empire had collapsed in the 5th century, and this was the time, when you can say the response to this disorder was feudalism, which was a decentralized and hierarchical system of protection and mutual obligation. Now, from this starting point, several dynamics, begin to operate. First, the towns emerged as a center of trade and commerce. And secondly, military competition among principalities made, some kind of welfare uh, possible because, warfare was expensive. So, and thirdly, the population dynamics. We know the Black Death of the 14th century has killed, roughly a third of Europe's population. So this made, labor scarce and gave peasants bargaining power they had never had previously. So labor institutions had to change. The manor system was not sustained when the workers had alternatives. So all of these dynamics interacted to gradually create an institutional environment more favorable for productive activities. North compares the Netherlands and the Spain as a contrasting paths, one producing the first modern economic growth and the other producing, centuries of stagnation. So basically, for the case of Netherlands, he takes Netherlands as a story of success and Spain as the failure story. Netherlands is story of success because the those countries have had, prosperous urban economies which were based on trade. Spain basically had, more systems in which, there was there was, some failures, such as, fiscal failures. So, and then comes, basically the role of beliefs in Western Europe's rise, and North does not explain the rise of Western world purely in terms of, some kind of material interest and institutional bargaining. He insists that the belief system, mattered very deeply uh, to what Europe is today now. So, North's alternative is that, the Christian belief system of the medieval Europe contained features that were hospitable to the evolution of the beliefs conducted to economic growth. And two scholars he cites, one is Benz and the other one is Benz and sorry, I forgot the name. One was Benz. Let me just recall. Just give me a second. Yeah, and the other one was White, which argues, that Christianity gradually evolves the view that nature exists to serve mankind.